Hello, everybody, and welcome to Vaidya's Chess Hub. So, in today's lecture, we are going to study about some of the basic opening principles. As you know, in the last lecture, that is on the feedback of the tournament, I spoke to you about the mistakes that you did in the openings, and I said that you should follow the general principles. So today, I am going to explain you about these general principles that you should remember during your games, and I hope you all have a notebook ready with you to note down some important points that I mentioned during this lecture, and also you should remember these points and study about them, think about them, that how some of the points you are not using during your games, when your opponent, whether your opponent is following these principles or not, and you should check the same and try to punish him for not following the principles, and try to see if you are all following these principles. So now let's start with some general idea of the opening. Now, as you know, the game is divided into three phases: the opening, middle game, and end game. Now, for you, the opening stage may be for 5 to 6 moves. For the for me, it is around 10 moves, you can say. But if you consider a grandmaster like, let's say, Jan Gustafsson or Surya Shekhar Ganguly, now these are the peoples who work on the openings day and night, and they help the world champions to prepare their opening stuff. Now they are known as the seconds. They help the world champions to prepare the openings. But whenever they think of any opening ideas, there is always some ground, some basic principles that they need to think of while discussing new ideas or while creating something new in the opening. And now these principles are always related with the novelty in the opening. You see any novelty from a game, there is always some scientific backing with behind it. There is always some principle that you are following more keenly than your opponent, and that's how the game works in your favor. So these principles you should all be aware of, and you should all remember these principles. Very important to know this to get at least a playable position against a good person. Now, chess, I always like to relate this with a war, because many people, as Bobby Fischer says, that chess is a war, you have to be ruthless. Now that's why the rules are also pretty similar to the war, if you see. Now if you have seen Ramayana or Mahabharata, there were meetings before the war began about the rules and about the regulations. And whenever you see, the war is always in between the parties with an equal strength. So if a stronger player is playing against a much weaker player, the stronger player has much more deep in-depth idea about the strategies that he is going to use. Like that also, the better player in chess has a better knowledge about some of the opening principles. He really spends time thinking over these principles. So you all should do the same. Think about the principles that I'm teaching you, and by think I mean that whenever I say you to note down some principle, you should always ask yourself why sir is telling about this principle. How does this really work in chess? How can I use it in my game? And as I know many of you are following me now on Lee Chess. If you follow some principle better than your opponents, and if you win a game, then you can send me that game. I will definitely like to check that. And also let me know if the lecture, you have understood the lecture properly or not, in the comment section. Now this lecture is for both the batches, the B batch as well as the A batch. The A batch, the starting points, you might know them already, but it is always good to revise, and from me you are learning this first time, so it's good that it would be good if you listen to those points as well. So now let's get into the topic. So first thing is importance of studying openings. Now I have decided to cover this topic into a complete depth, so that you get the general idea also why is it important to study openings. Now why do you think it is important to study openings? Now the simple answer to this question is that we play a normal variant of chess. We don't play chess 960. So the initial position is known to us, where knights stand, where the bishop stand and rook stand. So it always makes sense to have something prepared at home rather than to think at the board. Let's say if you play the Sicilian Taimano, it's good if you know about the Sicilian Taimano at home itself rather than thinking it at the board. So that's why you should study the openings, that you get a better idea about what is going to happen in the game than your opponent. The second thing is a general idea about the openings that I'm going to explain you now. Third is the types and strategies in the opening, and fourth point is the pawn center and piece center. So write down these points. Now we will go to the board to look at these points about the general idea of openings, type strategies, and pawn center and piece center. So now let's go to the board. Okay, so now speaking about the general ideas, you all know that the fight is always for this central four squares. Now, when I say that, again, you should ask yourself a question: why? Why these four central squares are important? Well, the logic behind this point is that the opponent at some point is going to castle. Let's say black is going to castle either king side or queen side. Now, at the start, we don't know what is going to be the character of the game. Where is he going to castle? So it always makes sense that you develop your all the pieces towards the center, all your center pawns, so that wherever he castles, whether king side or queen side, you always can shift your army in that direction to attack the enemy king. So that's the reason you should always try to gain control over the center as much as you can. The second important point is when these general principles are developed, it is all these principles are always applied in some positions to check that if you can play like that or not, and that's how the opening theory develops. So when you play, let's say, one e4, there are about six options that black has, and all these six options leads to a different kind of play. As I already explained you during the Taimano lecture, there are c6, c5, d6, d5, e6, and e5. These are the main moves, and out of which e5 and c5 are the main moves. Now, over the course of many years, it has been proven that the c5 and e5 are the best moves. Now, think about this by the center perspective. If you see the move d6 or c6 or e6 as compared to the move c5 or e5, the key difference in these two systems is that black is controlling the d4 square with e4 e5 as well, and with e4 c5 as well. He is controlling the d4 square. While if you see the Caro-Kann defense or the French defense, black is controlling the d5 square. So that's from that point itself the game starts heading into a different direction. As I have taught you already, that the Sicilian defense is a very fighting opening because black is not fighting for equality. Black is trying to get his own play with this move c5, gaining the square over the different central square. White has the control over the d5 square, or black is fighting for the different square. So that makes it more interesting, and the dynamic of the game also changes in that way, that the games become more fighting. Now these are classified into three basic criteria: e4, e5. These are termed as open games in chess because the positions are tend to be more open when you play e4, e5. E4, c5 are termed as the closed games, and e4, c6 and e4, e6, these are termed as the semi-closed openings. So you should remember this: closed openings, open game, and semi-closed openings. Now look at the difference in these systems. When you play e4, e5, it is hard for white to get in this move d4. Now when you play with the white side, it should be your aim to build a perfect pawn center with the moves e4, and you should try to play the d4. Now all the semi-closed openings like c6, e6, or even d6 as well, they allow white to build this perfect pawn structure with d4, with the two pawns in the center. But if you see the moves e5 and c5, they don't allow white to immediately get that without allowing the trade in the center. So when you play the move e5, when white plays the move d4, this center does exist, but black can take on d4, and the perfect center has been destroyed by the move e5. So that's the another reason that these e4 e5 and e4 c5 are much more challenging systems. Also, pawn center and piece center is something you should understand. What do I mean by pawn center? So let's look at these openings: e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castles. So pawn center means that you have both the pawns on e4 and d4. So this is termed as a pawn center. I will come back to it quickly, but let me explain you piece center as well. When e4, c5, knight f3, d6, this is the Sicilian Najdorf variation. Now you can see there is no pawn on d4, but instead white has these pieces on the central square. The knight is on the d4 square. So this is called as the piece center, that you have the pieces in the center instead of the pawns. Now the great player William Steinitz have pointed out this, that when you have a piece center, you generally have an attacking possibilities, and when you have a pawn center, you have space to maneuver your pieces and you have the space advantage. Now what do I mean by that? Let me explain you very quickly. If you know the character of the Sicilian defense, the Najdorf variation, you can see here very often, let's say black plays some move like e6, bishop to c4, and in these systems white has this piece play. All his pieces are in the center, so the game is much more dynamic. While you see this case where white has the pawn center, there is no any piece that is in contact with the black king side. So white only has these two pawns, and that's only his advantage. That's the only advantage in the position, but he has the space advantage, as William Stein says. So behind these pawns he can construct his plan anyway, and he can try to castle on the queen side and try to get play. So you should remember these two things about the piece center, and piece center provides attacking possibilities and pawn center gives the space to develop your pieces and to build the attack in future. So these were the general terminologies. So basic thing you should remember from these positions is that you should always try to fight for this central squares, d4, these four central squares you should always try to fight for. So now let's get to the principles now. So the first principle is try to take control of central squares as early as possible with pawns or pieces. Now we have seen the explanation for this one already. So now let's go to the second principle. Don't develop your queen too early in the opening. That helps opponent to develop his pieces with tempo. Now you can pause the video and write it down. I will go to the example over the board. Again, listen to the principle. Don't develop your queen too early in the opening. That helps your opponent to develop his pieces with tempo. Now let's go to board again. Okay, so when I analyzed your games in the tournament, I saw many of the players going for this line. They play e4, e5, and they go queen h5. Now let me tell you about this opening. When I started playing chess, the first tournament that I won was with this opening. Now you all know this step, that if black plays knight c6, you play bishop c4. By the way, you play either queen h5 or you play the move queen f3, one of those moves targeting the f7. And now black thinks that he should develop his knight first, so he plays the move knight f6, and then you give checkmate like this. Now tell me frankly, how many times against the higher rated players have you won like this with this type of checkmate? The answer will be very less than even 20%, I will say. Because the thing is now that everyone is studying chess, everyone is studying the openings, and everyone is learning very quickly. You are not going to find any players after a certain level who fall for this trick. who just get mated like this in 4 moves. But what happens when your opponent plays accurately against this system is that you get a worse position and you have to start, you really suffer with the white pieces, and that is not really at all ideal. I will just show you one game, as our rule says that you should not develop your queen early. What happens when you do develop your queen early like this in this system? I will share you some opening idea from Magnus Carlsen. One of the Magnus Carlsen's opponent played like this against him. Magnus Carlsen is playing with black pieces, and after the move bishop c4, you play the move g6, queen f3, again threatening the mate. But black plays the move knight f6 here, and knight e2, bishop g7, d3, d6, h3. Now you don't have any of this checkmating ideas. Anyways, black went for this knight a5, exchanging this important bishop on c4, which was bothering black. And now after knight c4, dc4, you can say this position is already fine for black. Black is going to play the move bishop e6 here. He will castle, sorry, he will castle next move. He will castle next move, and he is just totally fine here. So this is the way the attack does not work with the queen h5, that you play knight c6, and after bishop c4 you play g6, queen f3, you go knight f6, and then you complete your development. So Magnus Carlsen won this game easily. I have not put here the whole game because we want to study about the rule first. Now, developing queen early in the game is bad because opponent gets tempo. Now, for those who don't understand the meaning of the word tempo, tempo means that the opponent gets easy development by attacking some of your pieces. Now, in chess, you really have to fight hard to get a playable position with the black side. And when you are developing your queen early in the game, the black can develop his minor pieces effectively, attacking that queen, and the queen eventually has to come back. And by that time, all the pieces of the opponent are already developed, attacking the queen, and black already gets a good position. So I have selected a specific game by a former world champion Gary Kasparov, where he is playing against a TV news commentator, and the game starts with e4 d5, the Scandinavian defense, and Gary Kasparov is playing with the white pieces here, by the way. So a Scandinavian defense is a typical example of this principle, that why you should not bring out your queen early. This queen is vulnerable here, and as you can see, black has managed to exchange one of white's center pawn. So that is the advantage of the Scandinavian defense. But in doing so, he has brought his queen early out in the game, and after knight c3, we anyways wanted to develop our knights towards the center, and this thing we call as a tempo in chess. The queen is on d5. We can develop one of our piece by attacking the queen, so the queen has to move. So in short, in this position we are getting two moves from white side. One is this knight move, and the second knight move as well. So we say that we gain a tempo over black by playing the move knight c3, because now the queen has to move. There is no choice. He's not going to allow us to take the queen. So whenever, let's say, he moves it to d8 or to a5, you have one more move to develop your minor piece that you wanted to do anyways. So that's the meaning of the tempo. So knight c3 comes with the tempo, and in the game, now black has three playable moves here: queen d6, queen d8, or queen a5. Now these three are the playable moves, but in the game, black went with the move queen e6 check, which is again a bad move because white displays bishop a2, developing another piece. Now you can see white has developed these two pieces, and black has not developed any of his piece yet. So black plays the move knight c6, d4. Again, this move I will say it comes with a tempo because d5 is a threat, attacking two of the pieces. So black makes again one more queen move, queen g6, and now we come to another principle. Now this principle is known as don't go on pawn hunting in the opening. Now I have seen that most of you play this opening called as the Danish gambit, d takes c3 and either bishop c4 or knight takes c3 here. Now you know that this pawn hunting in the opening where black is taking on c3, taking on b2 is not good because you just develop your all the pieces. And that's what Kasparov notices here, that after queen g6, black is just making too many queen moves. So he deserves to get punished here. So what Kasparov does, instead of protecting this pawn, he offers it. Now, as black has already broken one of the basic opening principles, that you should not bring out your queen early in the game, he also breaks the second opening principles by grabbing the second pawn. This is the by this poison pawn, we term in chess. So Kasparov develops his rook to the g1, and after queen h3, d5, you can see again attacking the knights. So knight a5. This knight on a5 is most often the bad piece because it is completely dominated by two of the white pieces. After knight b5, queen d7 and bishop f4, you can see that white has managed to develop all his pieces. All his pieces are protected and very well placed. And after bishop f4, it's already a lost position for black because black cannot protect against this threat of knight takes c7. There is no defense at all. e5 also is hanging, or you can take n% as well, but there is never going to be any defense against this simple threat of knight takes c7. And Kasparov is just won here after knight f6 and knight takes c7. The game lasted for a few more moves, but it's just a lost position. So you can see how Garry Kasparov, the former world champion, uh, showed his understanding of the opening principles. First, this opening is pretty well known. Here, black commits his first mistake, making too many queen moves. He should really retreat and try to develop all of his other pieces. But what he did in the game, Kasparov just managed to develop everything with tempo here. d4 comes with the tempo because d5 is a threat. Queen g6. Now his opponent has already, as I said, already he has made too many queen moves. Garry Kasparov continues with the general principle that you should develop all your pieces first. And after queen take g2, rook g1, queen h3, d5, the game was over at this point. So there is one more thing that you might ask me, that Garry Kasparov followed all his rules. I agree, but the one rule he didn't follow, and that is the you should castle as early as possible. And you can see Garry Kasparov did not castle in this game. Now the reason is that when black has already done this mistake of not following two general principles by bringing the queen early and then by going for this pawn hunting in the opening. He has not managed to develop any of the pieces, and as black has not developed any of these pieces, even if white king is in the center, it is completely safe on even square. There are no real pieces attacking this king. So even if he has broken one of the principles by not castling, his king is relatively safe, and it is black's king which got into trouble after this move bishop f4. So when your opponent has already broken some rules, you can punish him for that instead of trying to follow all the rules by yourself. You can see this is the very instructive moment. If you castle here, there can be some bishop h3, or black can develop easily, and then he can get equal position. But Garry Kasparov sticks to this principle. He offers this pawn on g2 and gets this huge development advantage, and it is very important in the chess to get advantage in the development, because whenever your pieces are more developed, you have more attacking possibilities than opponent. So this was the rule that this is the game that demonstrates the rule that you should not develop your queen early in the opening. I hope it is clear to you by this game that how developing the queen early in the opening is not good, because it comes under attack by the enemy pieces, and eventually the king can also get in trouble because of this huge development advantage that white has. So now let's go to the next rule now. So the third principle is center pawn should always be taken if there is no danger, and the fourth rule is pawn hunting in opening is usually a bad thing. Now you know about this rule that pawn hunting in the opening is usually bad thing because you all are Mora Gambit and Danish Gambit players. So I have not included those examples in this video, but I'm explaining you about the center pawn, the thing about the center pawn. Now let's go to board again. All right. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Now, in the tournament, I saw some of the games where the game started with the move e4, black played the move e5, white played the move knight f3, and black played this move bishop c5. Now it is always a question, do you grab this center pawn or not? And that's the general principle. If you have a chance to grab a center pawn without danger, you should always grab the center pawn, because center pawns, as you know, this pawn has a lot meaning in itself. It is not there just to block this e pawn, but it is fighting for this d4 square. So whenever you take the central pawn, you also get the control over the d4 square. White will push the pawn to d4 without being threatened by this pawn on e5. So that's why this rule exists, that when you can take a center pawn, it is always beneficial to take a center pawn. But there are some cases where you should be really careful to take the center pawn, because as I will explain you with this example. By the way, against bishop c5 you can take this pawn, there is no real problem, because with the move d4 this bishop is going to get under attack and you can develop freely with your bishop, and then you can castle. So a center pawn can be taken here. But if you see in this example in the Petrov defense, after the move knight takes e5, this move black can take this pawn. Now the question actually arises here itself. When black plays knight f6 in this is known as the Petrov defense, by the way, those who don't know. White is attacking this pawn on e5 and black played the move knight f6, counter attacking this e4 pawn. Now white sees that the knight take e5 is possible because he will get d4 to protect his knight. But black should not take this pawn on e4 here, which is a little bit of inaccuracy, as you will see that white has a development advantage here, because white makes the first move. He doesn't really have development advantage, but he is on the move now and he can play the move queen e2 here. And now you can see this pawn grabbing by black is a little bit dangerous here. He cannot really go back because he steps into this deadly discovered attack with discovered check with the move knight c6. You can see the king is under check and also knight is attacking the queen, and even if queen goes to e7 we can just take it. So knight c6 already wins here, so you should be careful here while grabbing this pawn on e4. You cannot really take pawn. Even if you take after queen e2, black has to play this move queen e7, and after queen take e4 he can play this move d6 to take advantage of this pin. He will win the knight back, but after d4, let's say d takes e5, queen takes e5, and after these moves white will be pawn up. So it is a little bit tricky. You should not take this e4 pawn because of this move queen e2. That's why the theory has developed like this. You should play d6 first, and when the knight goes to f3 then you play knight takes e4. Now if white goes queen e2, then you can play d5, or you can play queen e7 actually. D5, then there can be d3, but you can just play queen e7 here, and you don't have any problems. Next move you can just come back as well. So that's how the theory has developed, that after knight f3, knight f6, knight take e5, don't take the pawn here, play d6 first, and when the knight goes back then you take back. And then white usually continues with knight c3, taking this development advantage, or goes for the move d4. That's how the theory has developed. So this is the example where you cannot take a pawn, There is one more game that you can check out. My game, I have included it in the feedback. My game against Ankit, or there's some game in the Rai Lopez where my opponent blundered the pawn on e5. I don't recall the name of the player, but I have included it in my feedback video, where he blundered the e5 pawn and in the Rai Lopez. So you should always be careful about grabbing center pawn in the opening. But if there is no harm, then you should definitely take the center pawn. It is always good. So now let's go to the next rule. So next rule is castle as early as possible. King's safety is most important. Now this is a very general rule that you should castle as early as possible, and it also makes sense because if your opponent is following all the general principles, he will have his pawns and his pieces in the center. So if your king also stays in center for a long time, then it can really get in serious amount of trouble, and it will be difficult for you to play that position. Now for this demonstration I have selected a game, but that game we will look at the end of the video. We will learn more about that video in the end. The game between Wesley So and Gary Kasparov, which demonstrates that what happens if when you don't castle. But you already know, I guess, one example where the opponent, if opponent doesn't castle, what he runs into. The game by Paul Morphy in the Philidor defense. I have given a lecture about that in one of the classes, and also Ameya sir has taught you about this game in the Philidor, where white sacrifices on d7 the rook. I am sure you all remember this game by Paul Morphy. So now let's take a look at the fifth principle. So always develop knights before the bishops. Now this game also has the demonstration for this rule is also given in the game of Wesley and Kasparov, so do check it out in the end. But there is a logic behind this rule again. Again, you should ask yourself why. Why knights before bishops? Now you know that knight has a very special move. He moves differently than queen and bishop and his other pieces. But if you see, the range of a knight is very limited. It can only jump up to 3 ranks or up to 2 ranks. It can only jump up to. So we in the start we know where our knights belong. It generally belongs on f3 and c3, and if you are playing on the black side, it belongs on c6 or f6. But in case of bishops, you are not sure if you want to develop it to b5 square or c4 square. So that's the general rule, that you should develop your knights before the bishops, because the knights positions we generally know where they belong, but the bishops we can vary. We can put it 1 square, 4 square, or 5 square sometimes, like in Rai Lopez. So generally you should develop your knights before the bishop. So these are the some of the conclusions that I have drawn for the batch B students, or these are for all the students. So first is develop each piece in a single move. That means that don't make many moves with the same piece. Don't make the uh, develop your each piece in just a single move. When you play knight f3, let it be there for some time. Develop rest of your pieces and then go back to moving that knight on f3. Second, castle as early as possible. Third, spot weaknesses in enemy camp and try to attack them. As we saw in the game of Kasparov and Letterman, he spotted this weakness on c7 and he immediately turned his attention towards that spot. Sequence of development. The sequence of development you should all remember. First, you should all develop your pawns to the center, then the knights, then the bishops, and eventually the king. The king necessarily means that you should castle. Fifth point is development with subsequent gain of tempo is always ideal. As we saw again in the game of Garry Kasparov, that the first move, the Scandinavian system itself allows development with tempo. Then again, when he played this move, Queen e6, then White played the move d4, again threatening d5. So there is a development with a gain of tempo. So it is always ideal. You should always try to develop your pieces in such a way that it threatens something. It creates some threat in the position that your opponent has to respond to, and these moves are always good. We call them as a tempo moves. And the sixth point, as we have already studied, center pawns are more valuable than flank pawns, and they should be taken without, if there is no danger in taking the central pawn. You should always take these central pawns, and their value is slightly higher than flank pawns. As I have already explained to you, the pawns are not there just to stay, but they control important squares also in the position, so that your pieces can be easily developed without being harassed by the enemy pawns. So they have some role in the center of the board. So when you can take the center pawn, always take the center pawn, but always see if there is some danger in it. So these were the some of the very basic points that I have explained to you, and now let's get to some of the advanced points from next slide. Now this is the quote that I really like by Dr. Zigbert Tarash, a famous player. I really like his all the quotes. You should all check out his quotes. He says that chess is a terrible game. If you have no center, your opponent has a freer position. If you do have a center, then you really have something to worry about. Now it's a little bit funny quote, I will say, because let me explain his point to you. But remember this quote that he says that when you have a center, when you have no center, your opponent has a freer position. If you do have a center, then you really have something to worry about. We will come to it when I go to the board, but let's look at the first principle now. Punish opponents' bad moves in the openings. Now, batch B students, if you find these topics little bit difficult, try to listen to them and try to think about them. This might be little difficult for you, these points, but these are for the A batch definitely, and you should check the examples. I think batch B students can also learn from the examples. So now let's go to board again to think, to understand what Dr. Tarash wants to say, and also about this rule that punish opponents' bad moves in the openings. Now let's go to the board. Okay. Okay. So now let's come to the quote first that we all read. That Dr. Tarash says that when you don't have a center, your opponent has a freer position, and when you do have a center, you have something to worry about. Now let me explain to you his concept. Now in the earlier days, in the, let's say, 1900 centuries or this, it was always believed that whenever you play a system like e4, or whenever you play a system like d4 d5, let's say this type of system, you should always play the pawn to d5. This system, you should always reply a pawn move by a pawn move. Let it be c5 or e5, doesn't matter, but you should always reply it with a pawn move. Now this was the concept back in the day, but there was a player called as Aaron Nimzowitsch. If you have heard of this player, he came up with a concept that these central squares cannot be only controlled by pawns, but you can also control them by pieces. And that's how some of the opening systems have developed. Like, for example, the Grunfeld defense, if you see, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, c take d5, knight take d5, e4, knight takes c3, b takes c3, and bishop g7. You can see this system where white has got the perfect center, but black doesn't have any of his pawn in the center. But if you can see, black is attacking the center with the help of his pieces. He is attacking the center with the bishop on g7, with the queen on c7. Eventually he will also play the move c5 to break it with the pawn, and then knight to c6. So all his pieces will attack the center. Now this was the process of Aaron Nimzowitsch, that he said that the pieces can also control the center. You don't need a pawn in the center. And that's exactly Dr. Tarash wants to say. Like in this case, you have the center, but you have to survive the counter attack that black is going to do here with the move c5 and eventually castle knight c6. But if, let's say, if you don't have any center, let's say black, let's say in the starting position white plays some random moves. Now these are not good moves for white. Let's say if you play like this. Now what Dr. Tarash wants to say is that if you don't have any center, now white does not have any center here, your opponent has a freer position. As I already taught you, black has the pawn center here. So with this pawn center, he has the space advantage, so he can develop comfortably. So that's what Dr. Tarash wants to say, that when you don't have any center, opponent has a freer position. He can castle and you are not really putting any pressure with the white here. But like in the Grunfeld defense, when you have a center, like in this case, you have the perfect center, you should be really thinking about it. Now why he says that? Because it is going to come under a severe pressure after c5, knight c6 and castle. You can see this bishop is a monster here, looking at this diagonal. So when you have center, you also have to be careful. When you don't have center, your opponent has freer positions, so you have to be careful. So in short, he wants to say that you should be always careful when you play chess. That's the basic point in his saying. So now let's come to the point about the punishing the bad moves. Now let me make it very clear that the principles that I explained you in the start, these principles are for everyone. These are for the beginners as well, and these are also for the advanced players and also for the grandmasters as well. So even grandmasters, they know about this principle, but they also know that when it is good not to follow these principles, and when how your opponent is not following a particular principle, and that's how they punish their opponents in the opening itself and get good position. That's the case with every stronger player you face. They know principle a little bit more, a little bit deeper than you, so that they get a better position. Now what I mean by punishing bad moves in the opening, let's take a look at this example in the Sicilian defense. Now this is the case, bishop c4. Now this system is called as a Fischer attack in the Najdorf variation. If you know about this system, this is Sicilian Najdorf. We have learnt about Taimano, where black plays the second move e6, but here black has played the move d6, and this is the Sicilian Najdorf variation. And this bishop c4 move is characterized as the Fischer attack. Now you can see that most of the black players are prepared up to this point, that they say I play the Najdorf. I'm a fighter player, I play the knight. But after bishop c4, it's a time when you need to know about much of a concrete moves. You just cannot develop. Now the rule says knights before the bishops, but if you play the move knight c6 here, if you don't know the theory in detail, you might develop the bishop and protect this knight. But the player who knows about the opening systems and opening theories pretty well, he will immediately spot that this knight development here is actually on the vulnerable square. This knight move is actually not good, and he will immediately punish this knight move, which looks very natural, by this move knight takes c6, b takes c6 and e5. Now you can see he is using some tactics. Now this is the second principle that I will be talking about. This example can be taken there as well, that the better players, they understand the principles, but they also use tactics to get the principles in their way, to stop the opponents from following the general principles. See, black was very innocent. He was trying to just develop with his knight to c6, but when he faces this type of problem and e5, you can already see that he cannot take this pawn, and both of his pawn and his knight are under attack. And if he takes this pawn, and you can pause the video and think what white can do here. White is instantly winning here. Yes, exactly. White is winning a queen here with the move bishop takes f7. You can see the queens are facing each other. So when this little distraction move comes, the king has to take it, and then after queen take d8, black loses his queen. So not it is not only that you need to know about the general principles, but as this is for the A batch, you should also know about the theory, that when it is good to follow the general principles and when you have to play exact moves. Like you should play something like e6 here already. Playing knight c6 is a opening inaccuracy. So that's the thing you need to know. You should also know about the general principles, but you should be also aware tactically to not fall for this kind of tricks. Okay, so this was the example of on punishing the bad moves. This was for A batch. I hope B batch also understood that how you should be careful, how you should be alert when you play a game. About this tactic, again you can see which type of center white has here. If you remember, white has the peace center here. So as I said earlier, white has the attacking possibilities, and that's what he created with his little tactic, and he won easily. Now let's go to slide again. Okay, so second rule is use tactics to get better opening position and to prevent opponent from developing comfortably. Now, very important point, note it down. Use tactics to get better opening position and to prevent opponent from developing comfortably. Now, let's go to board again to see exactly what we are talking about here. Okay, let me get to that game. Okay, so let's look at this game now. After the moves e4, c5, knight f3, d6, c3, knight f6. Now let's go from the start. So white has followed the opening principle. Good move, e4, developing a pawn to center. c5, good move, developing a pawn to center again. Pawns before knights. Then white goes very naturally with the knight, with the natural sequence that I already told you. Knight f3, d6, again mainline theory. So there is nothing really that you can criticize here. It is also controlling the e5 square. So c3, trying to get the perfect center after the pawn exchanges. So far so good. Knight f6 was played, attacking this pawn, and now the rule comes. Now the rule says that you should use tactics to get better position in the openings and try to stop your opponents from developing comfortably. Now let's see what white can play here. Let me check once. Liquidation. Okay. So after the move c3, knight f6, black is attacking the pawn on e4. Now what normal players would do here, they will play the move d3. If they think that my pawn is under attack, center pawn has the value, you should protect it. No problem, you can play d3. But if you want to be a little smarter and think about this advanced principle, you can play the move bishop e2 here. Now this is what we say, that using tactics to get the advantage in the development. Now see, this center pawn is of definite value. I have already told you that center pawn should be taken if there is no danger. So from white you should really think about protecting this center pawn because it is important. But white instead has played this move bishop e2. Now the question is, again the basic principle, should this pawn be taken? It's a free central pawn. Should you take this pawn? What do you think? Well, those who think that this pawn should be taken, it's a little mistake. This pawn cannot be taken because after knight take e4, we play the move queen a4 check, giving the check, and at the same time attacking this knight, and black loses a knight and loses a game. Basically, is a piece down here. So that's how White used this principle. He developed a piece using a little tactic, that is, this pawn cannot be taken. So that exactly the principle says, that you should always use the tactics to get the development advantage. And with that, this move, he also managed to develop one of his piece. So black should play bishop d7, and now this pawn is really under attack. Then you can play queen c2 or something, because now you don't have a check, as the bishop is covering this a4 square. So now white has to protect it, but this was the little trick that he set after bishop e2, that this pawn cannot be taken because of queen a4 check. And now I will share a little experience of my own, a painful experience, but it's always good to learn from others mistakes, so you can learn from my mistake. I played the Karokan system here. This was one of my tournament game against my good friend actually. So he played, I am playing here with the white pieces. I played this system against the Karokan. My opponent played the Karokan, sorry. He played this move d4, knight e2, and he played the move e5 here. Now think about the opening principles, general opening principles. Should this pawn be taken? Is there any problem? What do you think? Pause the video and try to think about it. Is it okay to take this pawn? Well, it is okay to take this pawn. You can take this pawn because there is no real tactic at the moment, and I thought my opponent is giving me a free pawn, I should take it. But then he plays this move knight f6, attacking my center pawn. And now the question is, what would you play here as white? I played a horrible move here. I made a very bad mistake. By the way, this is around 2 to 3 years ago, so I don't think I was I was playing well at that point as well, but still I I misjudged the position, and I fell for this trick, so not really good. I said that I should protect this pawn on e4. I played the move d3, which was really painful, and then he hit me with this move queen a5. As you can see, similar concept as in the last example, attacking, giving check, and also attacking the knight. And I lost the piece in same fashion as uh, black lost the piece. In this case, after bishop e2, knight take e4, queen a4. The same thing happened here as well after the move d3, queen a5 check. So you see, my opponent was little tricky here. He tried to attack this pawn on e4, and the most natural move to protect this pawn fails to this tactic. So that's how you punish your opponents with the tactics. So as one of the famous player has already said, that chess is 99% tactics. So when even if you study openings, you should always be aware about the tactics. There is nothing, there is no other way. You should always be alert tactically. So these were the examples where a player uses tactics to get the advantage in the opening and to stop opponents from carrying out his plans. Now let's look at the third rule. So the third principle is something really advanced that I want to tell you. Liquidation is the key to solve the opening problems. Now let me explain to you what do I mean by the term liquidation. Now let's go to board again. Okay. Now let me explain you in brief the definition of liquidation. Now in scientific term, let's in proper scientific term, when you have ice, it is in solid form. So liquidation means converting an ice into water, is we can say the liquidation. In terms of chess language, liquidation means simplification, simplifying the position. When your opponent has too many pieces attacking you, you should simplify the position to get rid of his attacking possibilities. Now let's take a look at this example, in the typical example in the Duco piano variation after bishop c4, bishop c5, c3. knight f6. We can go from the start. So good move, center pawn move, again black playing good move, both developing knights first then bishops. So far all the principles have been followed. c3, good move, trying to get in d4, knight f6, and now the move d4. And now I'll flip the board. Think from the black side, how would you play out this position? White has managed to establish this perfect center. So what would you play here as black? So this is the concept of liquidation, that when white has managed to get something, you should try to exchange the pieces, and after e takes d4, c takes d4, now what would you play? Now a bad move to play here would be something like bishop b6, after which white plays the move d5, and after knight a5, bishop d3, again this knight on a5 is terribly placed, dominated by this pawn on d5. White has the perfect center, white is ready to castle next move, and white stands better here. But instead of bishop b6, you should play concretely here and try to simplify the position. Now this can be a little difficult for b batch guys, so you can just listen to me now. But a batch, you should remember that here you are under pressure from black side, so you should play bishop b4 check. After bishop d2, again there can be sometimes bishop take f7 followed by queen b3, destroying your castling, or queen b3 immediately sometimes. So you should trade here, and again white has managed to establish this perfect center. So you should also share some contribution of your own in the center, and you play the move d5 here, attacking both of the white pieces. So this has to be taken, and after knight d5, queen b3, and knight e7, you can see, if you see in the starting position after the move d4, white has a little bit advantage because of this central pawns. But by this technique of liquidation, we have managed to exchange the pieces accurately, and after the move knight c7, the position is around equal. We will play c6 next, we will castle, and we stand absolutely fine here. So this is one of the ways in openings to simplify the position, to get a playable position out of the openings. From black, sometimes you have to accept this, you always cannot fight for advantage from black side. So this is the important term to remember: liquidation, simplifying the position to make it easy for you to play. And now as promised, let's look at this last game between Wesley So, a famous American player, if you have heard the name, and none other than Gary Kasparov, playing with the black pieces, a former world champion. So I will flip the board again. From white side, we are going to see, and we will see in this game how Wesley So played with all the general principles, and how Kasparov slightly misplayed the opening, and then he really got worse position. And that's the thing, when you get a really good position, this top grandmasters like Wesley, so they really don't forgive you for your mistakes, they really punish you. So now let's look at this game. So Wesley So, playing with the white pieces, plays this system. So you can see, after four moves only, we can see that Kasparov is a little bit going out of the principles here. He is trying to play a sharp, aggressive opening. He's trying to take risks to win here. Now, first of all, this was a blitz game. So we are looking at this game just to understand the opening concept. Gary Kasparov would never play like this in a classical game. He was a former world champion, by the way. So that's what this is, just a blitz game. So bishop g4. Now tell me which principles black has not followed by playing like this. You should tell me now. So now he has broken the general principle that knights before the bishop is the principle, and he has developed both his bishops first instead of knight. And white has managed this perfect center. He has developed one of his knights, so he goes for natural development. Now knight d2, again the principle using tactics to protect the center. Black cannot play knight take d4 here, because of the knight take d4, if you play bishop take a2, this knight can come back and white will be piece up. And also after bishop take d4, there is this g4 bishop is hanging. So that's why knight bd2 was a good move. Kasparov played e5 to get some contribution in the center. White played d5, knight e7, and these are pretty standard moves. And as you can see with this move c5, many of you would find this move difficult. Now look at White's position. He is ready to castle next move. He has the perfect development. He has managed to develop all his pieces. So, and Black, although he's a Gary Kasparov, if he has not castle, then you can attack him. And Wesley So just goes for it. He sacrifices a pawn, plays c5, exploiting the position of the king. As I said you earlier, you should castle as early as possible, and if you don't follow this rule, you will see what happens. So this is the demonstration game for the same reason. He immediately opens up the position when Black has not castled. Because his all the pieces are in the center, the rook is about to come to the open semi-open e file. He first opens the position and plays the knight c4 here. So when d6 will come, the position will really open up, and let's say after c takes d6, knight take d6 check, the king will be stuck in the center. So Black had to play a move f6 here, the move that he really did not want to play, because the natural square for the f6, the natural square is for knight on f6. But now his e5 pawn is under attack, and if he plays the move knight f6, then White can just play the move queen c2, protect this pawn, and next move take this pawn on e5, which really cannot be defended by a good move. So instead he had to play a f6, and now you can see already he is in slightly worse position now because of this open diagonal, this weakness around the king. So let's see how Wesley So managed. As d6, as I already said, open up the position when your opponent has not castled. You should not take this pawn. It's very dangerous. With the king has to move now, and it's the b7 pawn is hanging. The queen can join in. The bishop can come in. White is going to castle. It's terrible position for Black already. So instead, Kasparov played the move knight c8, trying to hold the position together. But again, bishop e3 came, attacking this pawn on c5. So Kasparov played d6. White continued with castles. Bishop c6, attacking the pawn on e4. And now d takes c7 came. This c7 pawn is really monster. You cannot exchange queens here because this pawn will stay there. After queen takes c7, again an instructive movement. White's king is very safe here. Black's king is not castled. White has lead in development, and whenever such cases arise, this e4 pawn is under attack. But again, our advanced principle that using tactics, Wesley So opens up the position without caring about his center pawn. So b4, and if you take this pawn, it's very dangerous. You can take on c5, destroy the black pawn structure, and then you have even this tactic of knight take e5, f take e5, knight g5, attacking this bishop. And when it goes back, you can see the bishop comes to b5, the rook will come to c1, the c5 pawn is weak, the king is weak, the knight is in fantastic position, the queen can come to b3, and white's all the pieces are enough to checkmate black king here. His knight on g8 is still not developed, so he's in desperate trouble here. So after c takes b4, opening up the position is a very good move. So after c takes b4, white played rook c1. Again, you can see developing with the gain of tempo. This pieces on the c file, they are little bit in trouble after this move rook c1. So black played the move knight g7, hoping to castle. White says queen b3, you cannot castle. If you castle, it will run into some horrible discovery after knight take e5, and your favorite type of checkmate also can occur here with the move queen g8. But that's not possible here because of knight take g8. So let me correct myself. Rook take g8, then there is knight f7. But always be careful about this, that after queen g8 there will be knight g8, so don't go for smothered mate. That I just figure out now. But after knight takes e5 check, king h8, you can even take on c6 or whatever you play. Basically this pin on the c file is going to be tremendous for white, so white will just win it. So after queen b3, you cannot castle, so instead black plays the move h6, trying to hold back the position. But then he plays all the normal moves, bringing the rook into the game. and after b5 he finally goes for the tactic knight take e5. If you know that Morphy game, in that game also he played c6 b5, and then knight take b5 happened, and after bishop take b5 they went into this combination over the pins. So here also b5 again pawn move punished with a tactical blow by Wesley. So knight take e5, f take e5, and bishop take b5. You see this pin is everything in this position. So taking the advantage of the pin that this bishop cannot be taken. So black played the move rook b8, and white said thank you very much. Now I'm never going to allow you to get rid of this pin. So black played queen b7 hoping to get out of the pin, but then again a combination similar to the combination in the Paul Morphy game, rook takes c6, knight takes c6, and queen e6, going for the kill. Again knight e7 is forced, and now the move bishop c5, and now bishop takes c6 is a threat, followed by queen takes e7. So he tried rook c8, but now after bishop take e7, Gary Kasparov resigned because this bishop cannot be taken because of pin, and if queen takes the bishop, then the c8 rook is hanging, and after king f7, bishop b3, the black king is almost mated here. Queen e6, then there is queen takes e6 and queen f7 checkmate. So in this position itself, after bishop take e7, black resigned the game, and Wesley So won this beautiful masterpiece against Gary Kasparov. Again, you see this position where Wesley So played this move b4, really nice move. White has all his things developed and has followed all the principles, so it's sorry, that was the time to punish black for his wrong play in the opening and for not following the principles, and the game became very tactical after that. Generally when you don't follow the opening principles, you have the worst position, and in a good position there are always tactics. So Wesley So got all these tactics in, and finally he won pretty easily this game. So let me know if you have understood all these general rules. Do write them down and also remember them. Also, if you have any doubts, you can ask me in the comment section. I will be checking the comment sections, obviously. So thank you very much. Stay home and stay safe, and use this time to work on your chess. Thank you.